In this life, some lines are not meant to be crossed. This confession is something I never knew I would be saying or telling anyone, but today I will spill it out. My name is Claire Taylor. I'm 44 years old, and I've been a widow for the past 5 years. Life after my husband's death has been a delicate balance of managing my son, Mark, and keeping our home a sanctuary for both of us. I've always taken pride in the warmth and elegance of our house. It's more than just a home, it's a reflection of who I am and the stability I strive to create. But recently, something happened that shook the foundation of everything I thought I understood about myself. If you enjoy stories like this and don't want to miss what happens next, make sure to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Things are about to get even more interesting. It started on a Friday afternoon when Mark's best friend, Jason, came to stay for the weekend. Jason had always been polite and well-mannered, but there was something about him that I began to notice more acutely that day. As I opened the door to greet him, his easy smile and respectful demeanor struck me in a way I wasn't prepared for. "Jason, come in," I said warmly, stepping aside to let him in. "Thank you, Mrs. Taylor," he replied, his tone courteous as always. "Please, it's Claire," I corrected with a laugh. "You've known us long enough to drop the formality, don't you think?" Jason smiled, a little shyly, and nodded. As he stepped into the house, I couldn't help but notice how much he'd grown. At 18, he carried himself with a maturity that made him seem older than his years. His kindness was evident in the way he spoke and carried himself, and it stirred something in me that I couldn't quite define. I led him to the kitchen, where I'd prepared some lemonade and snacks. As we talked, I found myself genuinely enjoying his company. He told me about his plans for college, his interests, and even his struggles, speaking with an openness that felt rare for someone his age. "You're such a bright young man," I told him, lightly patting his arm. "Mark is lucky to have you as a friend." The look he gave me in return, sincere, almost appreciative, stirred something deep within me. It wasn't inappropriate, I told myself. It was admiration, perhaps, or the simple joy of being able to connect with someone on such a genuine level. Mark eventually joined us, his usual boisterous self breaking the quiet ease Jason and I had shared. The boys disappeared upstairs, leaving me to reflect on the strange sense of comfort Jason brought into our home. Later that evening, the three of us sat down for dinner in the dining room. The table was set beautifully, as it always was when guests were over, a reflection of the care I put into making people feel welcome. The warm glow of the overhead light and the soft clinking of cutlery added a sense of intimacy to the meal. Mark, as usual, was full of energy, regaling us with stories from school and his latest adventures with his group of friends. Jason chimed in occasionally, his remarks laced with humor and his quiet confidence. I found myself laughing more than I had in weeks, and for a moment, I forgot the undercurrent of tension I had felt earlier in the day. But every so often, my gaze would drift to Jason. He spoke with a maturity and thoughtfulness that belied his age, and there was a steadiness to him that I couldn't ignore. I caught myself smiling at him more than I should have, and though I tried to tell myself it was harmless, I couldn't quite believe it. "Mom, Jason was the MVP of our last game," Mark said proudly, nudging his friend with an elbow. Jason shrugged modestly. "I just got lucky with a few good shots." "Don't be so humble, Jason," I said, smiling at him. "Mark doesn't brag about just anyone. You must have really impressed him." Jason looked down, his cheeks reddening slightly, and mumbled a quiet thank you. It was such a small moment, but something about his reaction made me feel oddly protective of him. After we finished eating, Jason stood up to help me clear the table. "Let me take care of that," he said, picking up a stack of plates before I could protest. "Such a gentleman," I teased lightly, leading the way to the kitchen. As he set the plates on the counter, I reached out instinctively and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, Jason. You're always so thoughtful." It was meant to be a simple gesture of gratitude, but the moment my hand rested on him, something shifted. Jason froze for a split second, his body tensing slightly under my touch. I could see the surprise in his expression when he turned his head to look at me, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. I pulled my hand back quickly, suddenly aware of how long it had lingered. "Sorry," I said, laughing nervously. Force of habit. Jason smiled, but there was something in his eyes I couldn't quite read. It's okay, he said, his voice steady but quieter than before. As he returned to the dining room to grab the rest of the dishes, I stayed behind, gripping the counter and taking a deep breath. What was I doing? It was a simple touch, a thank you, something I'd done countless times before with Mark or his friends. But this time, it had felt different. When Jason came back into the kitchen, I avoided meeting his eyes, focusing instead on rinsing the dishes. He didn't say anything about what had happened, but the atmosphere felt heavier, as though we were both trying to pretend that nothing had changed. Mark burst into the kitchen a moment later, breaking the silence with his usual boisterous energy. What's taking you guys so long? I've got snacks upstairs. Jason grinned and followed him out, but not before glancing back at me briefly. I couldn't tell if he was confused, curious, or something else entirely. As I finished cleaning up, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. Jason's reaction, the look in his eyes, it all stayed with me, leaving me with a strange mix of guilt and intrigue. This was supposed to be just another weekend with Mark's best friend. But something told me it was going to be anything but ordinary. As the clatter of dishes faded and the house settled into a comfortable quiet, Mark excused himself, heading upstairs to his room. I'll grab us a movie to watch later, he called over his shoulder. And just like that, Jason and I were alone in the living room. The soft glow of the lamp bathed the space in warm light, and the faint hum of the evening filled the silence. Jason sat on the edge of the couch, his posture relaxed but alert, as if waiting for some signal. I watched him for a moment, noting the way he carried himself. There was a quiet strength in him, a steadiness that seemed far beyond his years. So, Jason, I began. Breaking the silence, what's next for you? College, I imagine. He smiled, that boyish charm lighting up his face. Yeah, I've been thinking about business. Maybe finance. I want to do something that makes a difference, but I'm still figuring it all out. I leaned back in my chair, intrigued by his sincerity. You've got plenty of time to figure it out. But knowing you, I'm sure you'll excel at whatever you choose. He looked at me then, his expression thoughtful. Thank you, Mrs. Taylor. That means a lot coming from you. Claire, I corrected gently with a soft smile. Right. Claire, he said, trying the name out like it was something new. Our conversation deepened as the minutes passed. He told me about his dreams and fears, his ambitions and uncertainties. I listened intently, offering advice where I could. At some point, I began to share pieces of my own life, the struggles of raising Mark alone, the loss of my husband, and the lessons I'd learned along the way. Jason listened with a focus that caught me off guard. He wasn't just nodding politely, he was truly absorbing every word, asking thoughtful questions and responding with insights that made me forget he was only 18. And yet, I couldn't stop looking at him. His firm arms rested on his knees as he leaned slightly forward, completely engaged in our conversation. His voice carried a confidence that felt natural, not forced. Everything about him, his maturity, his composure, even the way he chose his words so carefully, was so different from what I expected of someone his age. As I spoke, I found my gaze lingering. On his hands, his jawline, the way his eyes lit up when he smiled. I told myself it was just admiration, but deep down, I knew it was something more. Jason noticed, too. Every time our eyes met, I felt the air shift, a silent understanding passing between us that neither of us dared to name. I don't know how you've done it, he said quietly, his voice pulling me back from my thoughts. Raising Mark on your own, keeping everything together. It's incredible. The sincerity in his tone hit me harder than I expected. Thank you, I said softly. But I've had my moments. It hasn't been easy. Jason nodded, his eyes searching mine as if trying to say something he couldn't put into words. And then I did something I never thought I'd have the courage to do. I leaned forward, closing the space between us. For a split second, I hesitated, every warning bell in my mind telling me to stop. But then, without thinking, I kissed him. It was brief, tentative, and completely unexpected. The moment our lips touched, my heart raced, and every part of me questioned what I had just done. When I pulled back, Jason's eyes were wide, a mix of surprise and something else, something I couldn't quite name. The room fell into silence, the weight of what had just happened hanging between us. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time in a long time, I didn't know what to say. The next morning, I woke up feeling restless, the events of the previous night replaying endlessly in my mind. My heart was heavy with questions. What had come over me? What was I thinking? I had crossed a line, one I never imagined I would even approach. I sighed, sitting up in bed and running a hand through my hair. There was no undoing what had happened, but I knew I needed to carry on as if nothing had changed. Mark and Jason deserved a normal day, and I wasn't about to let my lapse in judgment affect them. Throwing on my robe over my nightgown, I decided to head to the kitchen. The boys would wake up hungry, and the least I could do was make them breakfast. As I moved through the house, I could already hear Mark's soft snores upstairs, but Jason's room was silent. I reached the kitchen and began cleaning up from the night before. The sunlight streaming through the window felt warm against my skin, and despite my unease, I found a small comfort in the familiar routine. A few minutes later, Jason walked in, carrying a small bag of groceries. He had clearly gone out early, which struck me as thoughtful, though I couldn't quite meet his eyes when he entered. "Good morning," I said, keeping my tone neutral as I rinsed a plate in the sink. "Morning," he replied, his voice steady but quiet. He set the bag down on the counter and leaned against it, watching me. I felt his gaze almost immediately, and it sent a shiver up my spine. I was aware of how I looked, still in my nightgown, the fabric light and flowing, a little too casual for company. The morning air felt unusually warm, and I had tied my robe loosely, which did little to conceal the curve of my figure. "Did you sleep well?" I asked, turning to face him briefly before focusing back on the dishes. "Not really," he admitted, his voice soft but unwavering. "I kept thinking about last night." The words hung in the air, and I froze for a moment, my hands tightening on the edge of the sink. I turned slightly, my gaze darting to his, trying to gauge his expression. "Jason," I started, but I couldn't find the words to continue. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving me. There was no accusation in his expression, no anger, only curiosity and something deeper that I couldn't quite place. "I don't know what it meant," he said quietly, but I know it wasn't nothing. His honesty caught me off guard. I turned fully to face him now, gripping the towel in my hands for something to hold on to. The way he looked at me was unsettling, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt so genuine. "You're too young to be worrying about things like this," I said softly, forcing a smile. He smiled back, a little awkwardly but with sincerity. "Maybe. But I'm not blind, Mrs. Taylor, I mean, Claire." He stopped himself, glancing down for a moment before meeting my gaze again. "You're amazing." The room felt smaller somehow, the space between us shrinking without either of us moving. I wanted to say something, to explain or deflect or do anything to break the intensity of the moment, but I couldn't. "Thank you for the groceries," I said instead, my voice a little too brisk as I turned back to the sink. Jason didn't say anything at first, but I could still feel his eyes on me. "You don't have to avoid this," he said after a moment. "Whatever it is, I'm not running from it." His words left me speechless. As I busied myself with breakfast, the tension between us simmered quietly, both of us unsure where to go from here, but unable to ignore what had already been set into motion. We then kissed. Mark was upstairs sleeping. I was scared. What if he walked in us? I didn't know what came over me. I suddenly whispered into his ears, "I want you." In what felt like a flash, I turned around, and we did it. I haven't felt this alive in ages. Jason blew my mind. The day came to an end rather quickly, but when the house settled into silence, my mind was anything but quiet. Alone in my room, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thoughts of Jason swirling in my head. The way he looked at me earlier in the kitchen, his words, his steady presence, they lingered in a way I couldn't shake. I told myself it was nothing. He was young, barely stepping into adulthood, and I was old enough to know better. But there was no denying the pull I felt, the connection that seemed to grow stronger with every moment we spent together. Unable to bear the silence any longer, I got up and wrapped myself in my robe. The cool night air greeted me as I stepped out into the hallway. A soft light spilled out from the living room downstairs, and I instinctively moved toward it. Jason was there, sitting on the couch, his head leaning back, lost in thought. He looked up as I entered, his expression shifting from surprise to something softer, something unspoken. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He shook his head. "No. You." I hesitated for a moment before sitting down on the couch across from him. Same. For a while, we didn't speak. The quiet hum of the night filled the space between us, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. It was as though words weren't necessary, as though we both understood what the other was feeling without saying it. Eventually, I broke the silence. "Jason, about earlier. I don't want you to think I don't think anything bad about you, Claire," he interrupted, his voice calm but firm. His use of my first name felt deliberate, as if he was trying to make a point. I met his gaze, and the sincerity in his eyes left me momentarily speechless. "You're incredible," he continued. "You've been through so much, and you still manage to keep everything together. I really admire that about you." "Jason," I started, but he held up a hand, shaking his head slightly. "I'm not trying to make this weird," he said. I want you to know how much you mean to me. Not because of what happened earlier or anything like that, but because you're you." His words hit me harder than I expected. They were simple, but the weight behind them was undeniable. "Thank you," I said softly, unsure of what else to say. The silence returned, heavier this time, and I could feel the shift in the air. He was watching me closely, his expression open and vulnerable. I found myself leaning forward slightly, drawn to him in a way that felt impossible to resist. He leaned forward too, his movement slow and measured, as though he was giving me every chance to pull away. But I didn't. When our lips met, it was soft and tentative, a brief brush that was over almost as soon as it began. We both pulled back quickly, our eyes wide with surprise and something deeper. "Claire," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I went down on my knees right in front of him, and we did it right there in the living room. My mind was racing. What if Mark came down and saw us both doing this? I didn't mind. He then guided me to the couch where we ended what we started. Now I looked into his eyes deeply. We did it twice, when it was over. I stood up abruptly, my heart racing. This isn't right," I said, more to myself than to him. Jason didn't argue, but he didn't look away either. His expression was calm, understanding, as if he knew I needed space to process what had just happened. "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't even sure what I was apologizing for. "It's okay," he said simply, his tone steady. "Good night, Claire." I turned and walked back to my room, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. The line we had crossed tonight felt irreversible, and yet, a part of me didn't regret it. I walked back to my room, closing the door behind me. Alone in the quiet, I leaned against the door, my mind racing. I knew the kiss had crossed a line, but the feelings it had awakened couldn't be ignored. I felt torn between guilt and something unexpected. Hope, perhaps? A longing I hadn't felt in years. I lay down, staring at the ceiling, knowing I wouldn't sleep that night. Jason's presence lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake the weight of what had just begun. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more intriguing tales. Now it's your turn to weigh in. What do you think? Did she do the right thing by walking away, or should she have handled it differently? And if you were her son, would this moment be unforgivable to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We can't wait to hear what you think.